Hello and welcome to another short episode, or another installation of super healers. We've been talking to lots of amazing healers who are helping women heal in lots of different ways. So thinking about lots of different modalities across lots of different countries, which has been quite fascinating and amazing. And here today I'm joined by Lavinia. Lavinia she's got so many things she's going to talk about a little bit more in detail. She's an amazing body worker, an amazing movement therapist, and she has taken Feldenkrais and movement to another level, and she's going to tell us all about that.
Well, thank you, Abby. It's so good to see you, and it's wonderful to be here. And I just found it really interesting that you called me a body worker and a movement therapist, which are two things that I've never called myself.
Really?
So we'll start right there.
Okay, tell me through that.
Well, because as some of your viewers know, I teach something called the Feldenkrais Method.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of people do think of it as therapeutic and working with the body, but I find that language is something very particular. And one of the things that I love about the Feldenkrais method is that, when we talk about the body, it gives the impression that I'm working on some kind of machine or something. I'm a body worker, where we look at the human as a system. And so I call myself an educator, right? I spend my time helping people begin to understand why what they're doing is interfering with what they want to do. And same thing with the idea of a therapist. Again, sometimes the benefits feel therapeutic, but it's not because I'm fixing someone. It's because I'm teaching someone how they can better understand themselves. So it might seem like I'm, being picky with language. But
no, it's good.
But at the same time, for me, both body worker and movement therapist imply that I've got the power. And instead, I like to think that I'm teaching people to empower themselves through understanding how they move, why they move the way they move, how something has happened in their own communication with themselves that has created their challenges, and then how they can find a new way to communicate with themselves in order to be able to do things better. And we do that through movement.
Yes.
So when I work with people one-on-one, it's true, there is touch involved. But again, my touch is not because I'm trying to fix you or adjust you. Instead, I'm giving your nervous system information about how it moves, where it doesn't move, how it responds to an invitation to move, how it resists, where the trauma might be held that you've completely forgotten about. That can't happen if someone just goes, oh, you have a knee problem? Let me just fix that. There's so much more to the picture. And then the other aspect of our work is done all through verbal instruction. So there's no demonstrating, there's no you should do it this way, there's no telling you you're doing it wrong. It's about you listening and your nervous system taking in that information and going, oh, I never realized that my arm could do that. How cool is that? So it's this discovery process of my potential. So it's a beautiful way to get to know oneself, and through the process of developing that self-knowledge, living the life that you want to live. So we started out with a great misunderstanding. I love that.
No, it's quite strange, because that's the way I describe myself when I work with people, because I'm not doing something to them. I'm helping them to bring awareness to their own bodies. And by bringing awareness to their own bodies and the habitual patterns they use that may not be serving them well, then they can start to actually make changes. Whereas if I was doing it to them, then they would need to keep coming and seeing me all the time. Whereas what I want to do, and what we've discovered that you would like to do, and what you do, is that you empower people to take their healing into their own hands, take the movement into their own hands. Yeah.
Right. Because truly we're our own medicine cabinet. We're our own, self-healing mechanism. It's just that sometimes, whether it's injury or trauma or lifestyle, the system gets confused and decides that, oh, well, this is what you really need. You really need this rotator cuff to not work, or you really need your ankle to continually fall. And until we teach it another way, it's going to keep on doing what it thinks it should be doing.
And sometimes our bodies do that out of protection. So with women with pelvic floor issues and postnatal women, their body often starts to do things to try and create protection because the timing's out. How do you deal with that within Feldenkrais and with what you do?
Are you speaking specifically about pelvic floor?
Yeah, specifically about pelvic floors, I guess, Lavinia.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the
pelvic floor
summit, right?
Yeah.
So, so there's, again, as you know, as most of the audience knows, there are so many different reasons why different internal organs could start to malfunction, or why our pelvic floor doesn't want to support us anymore. And of course, a big trauma, people don't think of it as a trauma, but it is a trauma in so many ways, is childbirth. I mean, that is just gigantic in terms of what happens to the muscles there. And then sometimes when the system gives up the baby, it doesn't know how to come back, how to knit itself back, right? It's just kind of in that place, and that confusion then translates to the entire nervous system. So a lot of times I don't just work with the part,
Good.
right?
Yeah.
The part, because the part is only part of the whole, and the part is often, you could say, the result of a lot of other things. It could have been how your breath responded to the birth. It could be the size of the baby, and how do I bring that knowledge that baby's not there anymore. And then for older women like myself, there's a whole other story that goes on as we age, and we're dealing with, the laws of physics, and and
I'm
that
approaching that too, Lavinia.
we're losing muscle mass, we're losing muscle tone, right? We're losing strength in all of our parts, and it's easy to just give it up. And yet there are strategies for both of those things to help, again, re-educate those transverse muscles. And I know you can talk a lot to the whole idea of how our transverse muscles support our organs from the roof of the mouth and the diaphragm and the pelvic floor all the way down to our feet. So that sometimes just starting to work with, how do my feet support me? And again, so many women who have had babies, they'll complain about my feet are aching from carrying that weight, from dealing with that stress. And yet we don't ever think that, maybe those arches have something to do with what's happening in my pelvic floor. So I like to work with the whole self. Brilliant. So that the whole self starts to feel like those big muscles that support our organs can support me.
Brilliant.
Your turn. Your turn.
It's my turn to ask a question. So, Lavinia, you teach Feldenkrais, but you also teach Feldenkrais in a different way. Can you tell us a little bit about your program that you have?
Well, I have, it's not that I teach, do I teach Feldenkrais in a different way? That's a really good question. That's a really good question. So Moshe Feldenkrais, he had some brilliant ideas that, of course, have kind of, to me, they filtered out into our culture, so that a lot of people don't even realize that, sort of the origin of some of the ideas we have. And, one of those ideas that he was really strong about is that there's always 4 components of an action: thinking, sensing, feeling. So sensing is different than feeling. Feelings is our emotions, right? So thinking, sensing, feeling, and movement. That's constantly going on in us. I mean, you know, I might not be aware of the fact that I'm moving in a specific way because I just had a bad phone call. I may not necessarily clock that the tension in my shoulders has anything to do with my constant rumination about the fact that I can't pay the bills. But those things are constantly connected and interacting with each other.
Yes.
And I found that a lot of times people go for Feldenkrais specifically because they have a physical issue, which is fine. You got to start somewhere. I have a torn rotator cuff, I have a tight jaw, whatever it is. But my interest and sort of my curiosity is, well, how is this tied to the other components? So what is your thinking process in your life? Do you catch your thoughts? What's going on emotionally in your life, so that we can start to see how those pieces meld together through the act of movement? So one of the brilliant things, you know, he said, look, therapy can help you tremendously, but you have to talk for a really long time to get down to the root of something, you know, and you spend thousands of dollars. He said, but movement is right there with you all the time. And if you begin to understand how you move, you also begin to understand how you feel, what your emotions are like, what your, you know, clarify your thoughts, so that you can start to live the life you want. So, and I mean, you know, I know that there are other Feldenkrais practitioners doing that as well.
Yeah.
But what I then did was continue to study body language, for example, really study it. I'm also certified. I'm a lead teacher, whatever that means,
No.
in a system called the Emotional Body, which is a whole somatic approach to the expression of emotions and understanding how each one of our emotions has a specific breath pattern, has a specific muscle tonus, has a specific facial expression. And so by studying that and then using Feldenkrais to help break down those little things, you begin to understand those hidden background emotions that are affecting the quality of your life. And then the other aspect that I found really, really interesting is that when I go deep into these lessons, I start to see that he really, whether he knew it or not, I don't know. You know, I'm not one of those people that just goes deeply into the biography of somebody, but a lot of the movements that he developed come from ancient traditions. There are sequences that you look at it and you go, wait a minute, this is slow motion yoga. Or hold on a second, I think there's a Tai Chi sequence that goes with this. And you start to ask yourself, is there a commonality to movement practices that are connected to something greater than ourselves? And so all of this stuff, I've been doing it for 35 years. I had to give it a name. And so I have coined the term kinesa. And kinesa really is just an amalgam of kinesthetic, emotion, sensation, and attention. So that I'm bringing these different elements together in order to help people really feel that, you know, his whole thing was always, he always used to talk about the Oracle of Delphi and how right as you walk in the door, it said, know thyself.
Yeah.
What does that mean to know thyself? So that's where I feel like I'm just continuing. If he was alive today, I'm hoping he would have been doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, right. So to progressed it.
That's my vibe. It's like I would want this to continue to be a living tradition and not something that just gets stuck in. These are the 1,000 lessons that Moshe Feldenkrais did, and we're going to teach it that way. So that's all. I still feel that I'm very much using the Feldenkrais method and appreciating the wisdom and the richness that he brought to our study of movement. But I just have wanted to put a little ribbon around what I've been doing over the last, I don't know, I've been researching this for at least 15 years. So that's where I'm at.
So I've noticed this too, Lavinia, and it's great that you know to hear it from someone else who's also been researching it for so long, because I haven't been researching it for quite so long. But every time I learn a new modality, every time I dive deep into that modality, I start to see commonalities within the movement patterns that work, the movement patterns that help people to release and then create functionality in their bodies. So it's really interesting that you're saying that too. Are there things that you notice most with people? I guess I'm trying to say, you know, for me, when I work with pelvic floors, a lot of the time the women who come to see me are very hypertonic. They're in a state of real hypertonicity.
Mm.
And oftentimes my first question to them is, you know, do you grind your teeth? Does your jaw get sore? Because there's such a pattern between tension in the jaw, the roof of the mouth, and tension within the pelvic floor. So sometimes just by working with their mouth, not even going, I never go near their pelvic floors to be honest. You know, by working with their mouth, I can start to release their pelvic floors. Is there commonalities that you see with people who come through your door that would be interesting for our listeners, you know, to maybe notice in themselves?
Yeah, and absolutely the connection of jaw, tongue, mouth. Again, I just recently read an article that connected it to the soles of the feet again, the arches of the feet and your posture. So all of those things feed into the potential of losing support in that pelvic floor area. So the hypertonicity, I often feel again that it's the result of either a sense of having had a traumatic experience, or the stress of the whole process getting locked in there, or just the holding as a result of the pushing that then gets stuck. And but maybe our listeners don't know that there's like almost a muscular and or fascial link between the arches of our feet, the muscles, the adductors and the insides of our thighs up into the pelvic floor, that moves straight up into the tongue and mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And then the outsides of our feet up the outsides of our legs into the hip joints. And boy, the hip joints, we don't give enough credence to what's happening in our hip joints when we're carrying a baby and giving birth. And then that goes right up the neck to the jaw, right? And you can almost feel that even if you're just sitting there listening right now, and you turn your feet kind of ballet pigeon duck footed and press on the insides of your feet, you'll feel how the insides of your legs and the front of your pelvic floor kind of reacts. And you can feel it all the way up into your tongue. And then if you press the outsides of your feet, kind of go pigeon toed, you can feel how that goes up the sides of yourself into your butt cheeks, tightens up the neck. So we have this full body connection, and yet we tend to think of just the one part. So I love the idea that somebody comes in with a pelvic floor issue and you work with the jaw, because again, that's so Feldenkrais, because if we start from where the trauma is, right, then the person's already so stressed out and they've got so much going on down there, and then you're asking them to start doing exercises down there, it makes that nervous little body go, oh no, now what? But if I work with the jaw or the feet or the breath, I forgot to mention the diaphragm, which is a huge transverse muscle, right? Yeah. Just working with the breath sometimes can really help someone begin to find that relationship. And again, a greater redistribution of tonus. Feldenkrais talked a lot about how we all have what he called a certain amount of tonus in our bodies. We all need a certain amount of tonus because we're working in relationship to gravity. Yeah. But then what happens when we have a trauma or a lifestyle challenge or anything, the tonus distributes itself in the wrong places. So I'll have too much tonus in my jaw and not enough tonus in my pelvic floor. Or I'll have too much tonus in my shoulders and not enough tonus in my abdomen, so that my belly sticks out and I start to get back pain. So that redistribution of the tonus that's needed in the body is what we're looking for. And we start where it feels safe. If someone comes to me and they have terrible knee pain, I don't start with the knee, because the knee is already so scared and traumatized that it's going to protect itself. Instead, we look at all the parts that might be contributing to this knee pain. So it's the same thing with any part.
So as well with Feldenkrais and Feldenkrais movement, it's maybe a lot of listeners don't know Feldenkrais. So what's different about Feldenkrais to other movement patterns, say yoga or Pilates? What would they? Because a lot of people that I know, that a lot of my friends have never come across Feldenkrais. I love Feldenkrais, but yeah. So it'd be nice to hear how.
Well, of course, as far as I'm concerned, all somatic movement can be helpful. I mean, movement. Yeah, again, Feldenkrais used to say movement is life.
Yeah.
And, life is a process. And if you improve the process, you improve life. So, going for walks, doing yoga, running, whatever, if you're doing some kind of movement, you are helping yourself in some way. And, Pilates and yoga are also somatic education processes. They are teaching people how to move. The big differences I find is that in both of those modalities, and even a little bit in Tai Chi, it's a proscriptive method. You do it like this.
Yeah.
This is the warrior pose. This is climbing a tree. This, and I do think, by the way, that the Feldenkrais method has influenced these methods. I have seen how much Pilates and yoga have changed in the last 50 years. I started doing yoga in 1971.
That was a while ago now, Lavinia.
that was a long time ago. And I have watched how yoga changed from being do it like this, or in certain modalities, you're very wrong. Other modalities, not so much, to do it your way. You do you. Find your way to do it, right? It's become a lot less demanding depending on the kind of yoga you choose.
Yeah.
And I also think that Pilates has adapted itself. It used to be a lot stricter in terms of how you did it. But in both of them, there is sort of a correct way to do the asana. There is a correct way to do the particular movements in Pilates. And there's a lot of demonstration involved.
Yes, it's a lot of demonstration. Yeah.
Do it this way, or at least try to do it this way. And with Feldenkrais, it's listen to the instructions and do it according to your understanding. You don't have to look at anyone. You don't have to imitate anyone. You can explore it. And if you have a question, you can ask a question. So that's one big difference. The other big difference is that a lot of Feldenkrais lessons are done, as I put it, in the horizontal position. Not all of them, of course, because life is, after all, a vertical experience. But Feldenkrais really believed that one of the reasons that we have challenges sort of reorganizing ourselves is because we're dealing with gravity.
Yeah.
And that when you're lying down on the floor, you no longer have to fight gravity. You don't have to worry about falling. You don't have to worry about looking good. You don't have to worry about using different skeletal muscles to support your head. And that allows the system to relax a little bit. Just even in a lot of yoga places now have come back to allowing you to rest in between different asana processes. When I first started studying yoga 100 years ago, there was a rest in between every single posture. And then yoga evolved into this sport and this competitive thing and into this sort of power thing and you sometimes didn't get to rest until the very end of the class. That's now shifting back again. People are starting to take more rests. Now in a Feldenkrais lesson, we rest every couple of minutes, not because we're tired, but because you've just done something new for your nervous system and your nervous system needs to integrate it.
This is what we talk about in TRE. So I'm training to be a TRE provider, which is shaking therapy for those that don't know. Shaking, maybe not therapy, maybe therapy is now a bad word for that, I don't know.
Well, if that's what they call it, I mean, it's
yeah,
fine. It's whatever they
yeah.
call it,
So it's but then there's lots of periods of self-regulation, being aware that it's now time that your body rests, that you become more aware that, and that period of rest is when your nervous system, yes, assimilates or understands what's happened to it, where you've moved.
Exactly. So we call it integration, right?
Yeah, integration's a good word.
The idea that you're integrating the information into your nervous system. And again, one of my favorite quotes from Moshe Feldenkrais was that he said, the body does not understand English, right? You can talk to your body till the cows come home, and it's not going to understand what you're asking it to do. But if you do a movement in a slow, methodical, attentive way, it begins to understand what's holding, where the gripping is, and then it needs a minute. It needs a minute to just go, okay, I can let go now. Right? That is really, really important in our work, that period of integration, of letting it come in and process. So that's a difference between yoga and Pilates. Some other differences between yoga and Pilates is, between yoga, Pilates, and Feldenkrais, I should say, is the fact that I think I said that there's no modeling. There's never really a time, and there's no real correction during the class. I mean, the only time that I've, will say something, and I rarely actually say it to a specific person, but like, say, for example, I say, raise your right arm up to the ceiling. And there's one person that consistently raises their left arm up to the ceiling. I may find ways of saying, well, how about the arm by the door? Because maybe that person is dyslexic, or maybe they just weren't listening, or maybe they have an injury with the arm that I asked them to lift, and so they're choosing to. So you have to find how to language something when you see that someone's way off.
Yeah.
Right. And then a lot of times you can see when someone is modifying in order to take care of themselves, so that you don't have to point anything out to anybody. You don't have to say, oh, Kathy, you're reaching with the wrong arm. You would never say that. You would just give different ways of giving Kathy the experience that maybe she wants to switch arms to the other side,
So with Feldenkrais as well, I know because we've talked before, and this was really interesting for me. So there are some Feldenkrais movements that have made it into popular classes, and we talked about one in particular, but I'm sure there are more. And I'm going to let you tell us about the one that's I know that I think you're going to talk about.
Well, and
all the time,
and it's interesting because you started out with Pilates and yoga. And they have both integrated this idea. So some of your viewers may have heard of this idea of the pelvic clock, right? This idea that either in sitting, I'm just going to back up a little bit so you can see my pelvis.
Yeah.
So if I'm sitting, then you could say I'm sitting on a clock. Not a digital clock, an analog clock, so that 12 and 6 would be me tipping my pelvis forward and backward. 3 and 9 would be side to side. If I was lying down, and you can also do it in sitting, you imagine that clock is actually behind your pelvis, that lower sacral area, so that you're working in a slightly different way when you're sitting, but when you're lying down, you're kind of pressing on the floor in around the clock. And there's many, many different pelvic clock exercises. Relating it to this relationship of the pelvic floor, though, is really interesting, because when you start moving your pelvic clock, again, you start to feel those transverse muscles participating, and also your hip joint muscles, which, I don't think we give enough the credence is maybe not the right word, but the relationship of those hip flexors to what's happening in the pelvic floor, because the pelvic floor is not just one muscle, right? It's a series of muscles that are like a web underneath, and they are connecting to your hip joints. So as you're moving in this way, you are influencing, strengthening, toning, and educating, again, that word education, your whole pelvic region. So I don't know when it started to happen, but I started to notice, like in Pilates classes and in yoga classes, suddenly people would say, and now think about this pelvic floor. And I'd be like, wait a minute, that came from Feldenkrais. Now, I personally wonder whether it came from Feldenkrais. Sometimes I find things in my research, women, mostly women, educators from the 1920s, the 1930s, who were big in Europe or in different parts of the United States, students who had developed their own movement methods. A lot of their ideas I find in the Feldenkrais method now. So sometimes I ask myself, did he maybe find the pelvic clock in one of
Somewhere
those
else.
things
Yeah.
and just made it his own, which is fine. We're always making it our own, right? But that's an example of how something so practical, so sensible, so helpful has just found itself in our popular culture, so that you'll find it in anything. I don't know. I've never experienced it in a Tai Chi class, but I bet you could.
Not yet. So yeah, so for people who are watching as well, the pelvic clock I use in my classes because it teaches us the relationship between the psoas muscle. So the psoas muscle is a muscle that comes from our diaphragm or from the back of our spine, about where your bra strap is, and it comes down and it merges with your pelvis here. Here's a pelvis. Have we quick look at. So it merges here. It comes in here and becomes part of another muscle, and then it comes through your pelvic floor, and then it comes in and becomes your hip flexor at the front. It comes over your hip and into your femur at the front. So it's a really amazing muscle for working with your pelvic floor, both in pregnancy and in postnatal as well, and also as we age with posture patterns. I'm sure you agree, Lavinia.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the psoas muscle, which some people actually also call it an organ.
I
I don't
know.
know if you come across that, but this idea that when I first started doing research in the psoas, everybody called it the fear muscle, because it's related to fight, flight, freeze, all this stuff, that it gets stuck. But if you look at it from the other perspective, you could say, well, it's your safety organ.
Yeah.
Because when I can get the psoas to respond and relax, it can trigger that vagal parasympathetic rest, relax, digest response. So it's like so many people were always just talking about the trauma of the psoas muscle and forgetting that the psoas muscle also has a lot to do with feeling good. And it's a huge muscle. And I find it interesting because you mentioned the diaphragm. The right psoas actually goes through your diaphragm. So as your diaphragm is moving, right? Again, the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, we're talking about these transverse muscles. If I get tight in my breath, then I get tight in my psoas, then I get tight in my pelvic floor. So how do I begin to find that sense of safety? And again, it brings us back to the emotion. There's so much emotion that goes on during pregnancy, not to mention all the hormones that are making you emotional. But there's all the stress. Oh my gosh, especially now having a baby in our times, there's so much stress.
Yeah.
And so how do I find a sense of safety? How do I
This is
find
very important too, Lavinia. This is really important, the sense of safety for the psoas, especially during pregnancy. There's a lot of alternative birth women, doulas, and midwives who talk about the psoas being like the runway for the baby. So if the psoas is beautiful and supple, the baby sits much further back in the body. and that allows, and then when the baby's ready to be born, it almost acts like the runway lights for the baby.
Mhm.
Whereas
Mhm.
when we're in a state of high alert, and you see the psoas is in that kind of fear thing that people talked about before, and it's not the way I describe the psoas, but I've heard it described that way too. Then we have this like thrusting forward of the rib cage, this very anterior tilt of the body, and this tightening of the psoas. Yeah, yeah, it's something I've noticed as well. How do you work with the psoas, Lavinia?
Well, of course, I don't work with
No,
the
you don't
so
work with the psoas. You work with the person. I know. I keep walking down that road, don't I?
but first of all, and I love that you brought up that postural thing, because it reminds me of course, startle reflex, and how we can get trapped in variations of startle reflex. Most people think that a startle reflex just means that I do this, but it's really, this is the finale. And when I am triggered in a startle, you do literally go into that anterior tilt, and the chest heaves up and the head goes back like that, and many people just get trapped right in that little bit of startle reflex, and that impacts on the psoas. So when I see that someone has potentially trauma, or holding, something's going on in the hip flexor, or even the knee, or their posture, the way they hold themselves. In somatics, of course, they talk a lot about trauma response in their posture, and they relate that. But I always go to, okay, if the psoas is tight, that means it's in flexion.
Yeah.
How can I support that flexion? Not by trying to stretch it. So we explore different ways of finding pleasurable flexion, whether it's, lifting the knees, rounding the back, curling up on the side, softening. Sometimes, again, I'll go back to those darn arches of the feet,
I know.
because sometimes it's all the way down there. You can see a person, they walk into, practically their toes are practically elevated, right? And that they're in that state of gripping in that psoas area. And so just finding gentle movement. And I got to tell you, again, going back to education, I would say 90% of the people who come to see me, or sometimes they'll even come and they'll say, oh, my therapist said that my psoas needs work. That'll be like a comment. And I'll say, well, do you know where your psoas is? And they don't even know. They just think of it as something in their bodies. And when I start to explain, as you just did so beautifully, where it originates, how it travels, how it ends up like on the inside of your thigh bone, they're like, oh my God. Oh my God. And you could almost feel like they're wanting to hug their leg and feel that connection, realizing that they've been in this kind of tonus all this time without even realizing that this deep muscle just needed to fold a little bit. It just needed some breath.
So we're coming towards the end, Lavinia. Of
I
our
know.
session. I know, and it's gone like
I could
that.
talk to you all day.
I know.
We could just talk about psoas muscles all day long.
Oh, I can talk about so. I mean, the big thing for me, as a kind of thing, I know for you to also think about or comment about. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Is for me when I think it's the psoas as well. It's very much I try to create safety for the person, because generally for me overall, I've noticed, and I don't know if this is something you notice too, that issues with the psoas where it's tension and tight come quite a lot from the emotions. So, and again, we come back to the emotions. If somebody's feeling anxious or fearful, or there's grief involved, quite often that can have a huge impact on your body through the psoas to the pelvic floor.
Yes, and that's why I was saying that it's the safety organ, right? Yeah. When I'm feeling calm, relaxed, the psoas muscle is also calm and relaxed. Again, acknowledging that we are emotional bodies. The emotions are constantly there, constantly talking to us. Even when I feel like I don't have an emotion, I'm just hanging out, there is a background emotion. There's always chemistry going on that is telling me what my state is. And if I'm not aware of it, then it goes to my muscles.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm not aware that I don't feel safe, if I'm not aware that I have like a constant thought repeating itself all the time about how something's going wrong, if I don't bring my own somatic awareness to that, then I can't get rid of the feeling. You can go to a zillion therapists and it won't, physical therapists I'm talking about, and it won't help if you don't connect it to what's happening to you emotionally. Now, a person can have an injury. I mean, you could have a physical trauma while giving birth, right? I mean, that's not an emotional thing, but what happens afterwards is the emotion.
Yeah, it's when women feel like they're broken or they've done something, it was their fault. And that's
Right.
when the emotion comes in. That's where
Right.
that kind of negative chatter in their heads comes in, that they're broken and somehow they can't be fixed. And that's kind of this whole summit is about introducing our women out there everywhere to people like you and everybody else, and
And
giving
it's important to realize that when you've had a trauma, whether it's childbirth or challenges in life before the childbirth, that the nervous system makes the choice for you. It's not like you sat there and went, I think I'm going to do a prolapse pelvic floor. What the heck, right? It's not an intentional mental construct. It's somehow the nervous system taking that instant of pain or sorrow or trauma and creating a habit that's right there. And then the rest of the body forgets what it was like before. Literally, again, going back to somatics, he coined this term, sensory motor amnesia. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
I do, yeah, no, I know
Right.
somatics,
Right.
yeah.
So all of a sudden your pelvic floor forgets what it was designed for. It forgets how to do what it wants to do. And so we have to kindly re-educate it. It's like if you broke your leg, you have to relearn how to walk. It's the same thing, but you have to do it with loving kindness.
Agreed. So it's bringing the pelvic floor back into the team, or bringing the injured part back into working as a team. I always talk about it's part of a team. It's part of your breath team. It's part of your locomotion team. It's part of your stability team. And
I love that.
At some point it's lost its place in the team, and we have to get everybody else working really well together so that it finds its place in the team again. And so we're on the same page. Sorry.
I love that metaphor though. I love the idea of like bringing it back on the team, like bring it back online. Come on, we don't want you on the bench. Come on.
Yeah, you're not going to sit on the sidelines. Come on, let's get you back involved. Totally. And I think that's a big thing. I think women are very, for a last thing, I guess, women are really scared about moving. So once they've had trauma to the pelvic floor, or once they have pelvic floor dysfunction, they become really scared about moving. And I think a big thing for me, and I'm guessing for you, is that movement is one of the best medicines for them.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. To me, movement is the answer, because when I move, I'm also letting things move and bringing it back to emotion, remembering that the word emotion means to move out. It comes from the Latin move out. So,
Yeah, so keep moving, ladies, it's really important. So if people want to get in touch with you, Lavinia, I know that we're going to have information after this for people to be able to get in touch with you, but how best for them to get in touch with you? Via your website?
Yeah, that's really the easiest. I mean, I have contact information there. I also have information, lots of information about the Feldenkrais method there and about Kinesa. So, you can dive into the website, and if you have questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So
Brilliant.
that would be ideal. It would be great.
Excellent. So, thank you so much for being here today. I really
Well,
enjoyed
thank you.
talking to you again. I love talking to you. I could talk to you all day. But yeah, thank you so much
You
for
know,
taking the time to spend with us today as well. And I
okay.
look forward to meeting you again at some point, Lavinia.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the good work you all are doing. I mean, really, truly, this is such important work. And I love that you're focusing on this aspect of women's health.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely an area that's needed a spotlight shone on it for a while. So thank you, Lavinia.
Okay.
Okay, I'll
Bye.
stop recording.